While traveling in Southeast Asia, you'll most likely encounter headless Buddha statues, especially at the world's 3 major Buddhist heritage sites: Cambodia's Angkor Wat, Indonesia's Borobudur, and Ayutthaya, the second dynasty of Thailand. One might wonder why these revered Buddha statues are often found in this condition. While each country has its distinct historical reasons, there are generally 4 main causes. The first is natural phenomena. Most headless Buddha statues are stone Buddhas, carved from solid rock. Carving stone is an incredibly difficult task, and this was especially true for ancient stonemasons, who had to do all of the work with simple chisels and hammers. For more detailed work, stonemasons preferred to carve the body, head, hands, and other parts separately, rather than carving the whole figure from a single stone. These parts were then assembled after the fact. The head, being connected with an iron spike to support its weight, made the neck the weakest part. These statues, exposed to the elements over centuries, eventually succumbed to relentless rain and wind, leading to their broken necks. This vulnerability to natural weathering is one common reason for the headless state of such statues worldwide. Earthquakes also posed a significant threat to these statues. Akin to leaves falling in an autumn breeze, the heads of these statues would crack and fall during seismic activity. For instance, Borobudur in Indonesia was once completely buried under volcanic ash, following a nearby volcanic eruption in the 11th century. Many Buddha statues in the surrounding area lost their heads due to earthquakes triggered by this event. The second reason for the prevalence of headless Buddha statues is looting and trafficking. Borobudur Temple, the world's largest single Buddhist structure, originally housed 504 Buddha statues. During the 19th century, under Dutch colonial rule, the temple, which had been covered in volcanic ash for more than 800 years, became a hotbed for grave robbers. The heads of Buddha statues were considered a talisman that would bring good fortune and one of the finest and most sought-after gifts for colonial rulers. The Dutch, seeking to establish political relations, even presented heads from Borobudur to the King of Thailand, a Buddhist kingdom. It is estimated that hundreds of Buddha heads from Borobudur were sold throughout the world. In Ayutthaya, the former capital of Thailand, numerous Buddha heads were sold to private collectors in the United States and Europe. Some of these were discovered in the Art Institute of Chicago, one of America's top art museums. Unfortunately, and yet unsurprisingly, Thailand's requests for their return were denied. The statues in Wat Saket in Laos, and those in Cambodia's Angkor Wat also fell victim to European looters, with their heads being severed and sold. The situation in Cambodia is particularly tragic. The Khmer Rouge, the communist guerrillas responsible for the mass killings known as the Killing Fields, also engaged in selling Buddha heads because of their monetary value. They used the profits from the sales of these precious artifacts for personal gain and to buy weapons. The targeting of Buddha heads for trafficking stems from their high financial value and the relative ease of removing and transporting just the head, as opposed to needing to move an entire statue. As a result, many Western museums are filled with Buddha heads, while many Buddhist sites in Asia are left with only the torsos. Even today, Buddha heads are still openly traded in the market. The third reason for the prevalence of headless Buddha statues is religious persecution. One of the many repercussions of the medieval Crusades was vandalism. Crusaders routinely destroyed anything they deemed to represent false idols, predominantly Greek and Roman temple sculptures. A similar pattern occurred in 18th and 19th century Asia. To the Christians from Europe who colonized Asia, Buddha statues were no different from the Greek and Roman false idols destroyed by the Crusaders. This righteous indignation and lack of remorse regarding the demolishing of temples and severing of the heads of Buddha statues stemmed from their view that it weakened the authority of Buddhism and asserted the supremacy of Christianity. These acts of vandalism paralleled the practice in Central and South America, where churches were deliberately built atop destroyed Incan temples. Religious persecution externalized via the destruction of Buddha statues also occurred due to internal factors. Around the time the Dutch were looting Borobudur Temple, Indonesia had transitioned from a Buddhist nation to a Muslim one. For Muslims, Borobudur no longer held the same sacred status. Indonesia's temporary indifference to the trafficking of Buddha statues can be partially attributed to this religious shift. In the 1970s, Pol Pot's communist regime in Cambodia used armored vehicles to transport numerous artifacts from Angkor in order to sell them. They even used Buddha statues for target practice in shooting exercises. This mirrored the anti-religious sentiments of communism, echoing Karl Marx's statement, "Religion is the opium of the people," and contributed to the devastation of Angkor's heritage. Finally, the destruction of Buddha statues can also be attributed to symbolic elimination. Throughout history, Southeast Asia has often been a battleground for Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia. Thailand, influenced by China, often found itself in conflict with Myanmar and Cambodia, the traditional powers in the region. Thailand and Myanmar alone have waged over 30 wars, often staking their national fate on the outcome. These were intensely bitter rivalries, and the victors would habitually decapitate the Buddha statues of the defeated nations as a means of symbolically obliterating their spirit and culture. By beheading the sacred icons of their enemies, they aimed to instill fear and ensure that the people they had conquered lacked the will to rise against them again. This practice of symbolic destruction has deep historical roots. Ancient Egyptians would selectively target the noses of statues considered precious by their enemies, believing that removing the ability to breathe would sap their life force, preventing their resurgence. Similarly, during the 20th century, the Soviet Union, which had suffered under raids by the Mongol Empire, targeted and decapitated numerous Mongolian Buddha statues, both as an act of retribution and to crush the spirit symbolized by these icons. Perhaps as a consequence, Mongolia diminished in international standing, becoming a relatively insignificant nation. However, in Southeast Asia, the situation was different. Just as Europeans long fought each other while following the adage of "an enemy's Jesus is still an enemy," Southeast Asian nations regarded an enemy's Buddha as an enemy and sought their total annihilation. However, contrary to expectations, the destruction of Buddha statues didn't yield the intended effect. The afflicted nations repeatedly fought back, continuing their historical rivalries. Should wars erupt again, it's likely that the victors could once again target the Buddha statues of the defeated, continuing this age-old practice.